Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Photoshop by Eduonics. In this lecture we're going to be going into using Photoshop with Illustrator, and particularly the exchange of vector files and information and how Photoshop interprets them. Also, and this is what we're going to start out with, how to vectorize something. In Photoshop it has some modes such as posterize up an image under adjustments, or you can do this as an adjustment layer if you need to watch that video. There's a video on adjustment layers in this series. And you would hit posterize, and as you can see it breaks it up into colors based on your selection. The higher you go, the more it starts looking like the original picture. After about 30 or so you can't really tell the difference. And you would actually double this. So right here we have about, well, we actually have about maybe 10 different colors here. But just to show you, if you want to, you don't even need to posterize it, it can help. And I posterized this previously with an adjustment layer. I'm just going to go back and take the original, copy the whole thing, or you can take the source image and we'll just bring it in here. And we'll go up to Object and Artboards, fit the selected art, and that will make the one artboard, or however many you had originally. It'll make it, all one. And right here we have our image trace up. Now the reason you might want to make this in a vector, of course, is if I wanted to make this image and make it really big, an image of a person or a poster I designed, and I didn't want to design it actual or billboard, and I didn't want to design it at the actual billboard size, which would take an enormous amount of resources, especially in Photoshop. Then I could take a normal sized image and bring it in here, and what's going to happen is if I do it at full size, it's going to give me about 100,000 anchor points. So if you want the best you can get, and anchor points doesn't matter, you would go to High Fidelity Photo, and the settings are going to be, and I'm going to hit stop, take it off of preview, because it'll actually render it every time you make a little change. But I'm going to hit preview and pause just long enough for it to work, but I'm going to tell you it takes about 5 minutes. It can take up to that long. So you'll see what it looks like afterwards, and then afterwards this will be scalable to the size of the world if I wanted to. If something could actually print that, but you can make it as big as you want and won't lose any resolution when you're done. So you might not be able to tell, but right now this is vector. And also if you take a look down here, you'll see that it has almost 500,000 anchor points. So like I was saying, if anchor points don't matter, and you just need to scale it to get it bigger, go ahead and use High Fidelity Photo. And if they do matter, what you're going to do is, and I'm going to just explain it, but basically you're going to want to, I'll show you with a new image. Copy this just like you were before. Take it over into Illustrator and paste it. And you can also see a comparison. Believe it or not, this is fully vectorized now. Also, what you'd want to do with it once it's vectorized is go up to Object Expand, and then you'll see it'll turn blue because it has so many anchor points. A lot of times you're limited how many anchor points you can use, and what you're going to want to do in Illustrator is to bring it in and shrink it, and you're just going to have to play around to find out what the best size is. And once you've shrunk it, you want to go up to Rasterize, and it'll come up as high. You can choose something like Screen, or if it was already Screen, choose Other and set it to something less than Screen. In this case, I'll show you how much of a dramatic reduction it is. We'll do half a screen and just hit OK. Make sure you're in the right color mode. This is usually going to be print if you're wanting to vectorize it. So right now it's rasterized it. Looks like it's created a little bit of white around it. You can select to create a clipping mask around the object. It's very low definition actually. I'm going to just rasterize it regular 72 so you can see, or we'll do 150 actually. So it's just enough, you can see the details, see the tree, see its grass, it goes all the way back. And we're going to hit preview on, or actually we're going to go to high fidelity photo again. Well, you can hit something like 16 colors, would look good for this since there's basically just green and brown, which is probably just green because of all the reflected light. It's your choice. I'm going to hit high fidelity. You can hit low fidelity actually. It's probably also a good choice because of the small amount of pixels. This will take significantly less time. We've shrunk it and we've reduced the pixel depth by half. So it's actually already done. As you can see, it has 12,000 anchor points. You might want to choose something a little higher fidelity, or you might want to choose a little bit higher resolution image. This is trees, and you can still tell it's trees and grass, but if it was a person's face, it would still bear their likeness. It would just have all the hallmarks of having been vectorized. So if we pick high fidelity photo in this case, and it takes a little bit longer, and we can compare the amount of anchor points too. It goes up by about 5 times the amount of anchor points. So you can also make it bigger, smaller, you can play around with it. If you bring the corners down, the paths up, or the paths down, the corners up, and the noise, if you actually raise the noise, all those things will decrease the amount of anchor points, and there's other things you can do. But generally, like a shirt company or whatever, they'll limit you to like something like 10 or 15,000, so that first one would have been okay. It also helps in Photoshop if you posterize this before you actually do it. And that's adjustments, posterize, and we're in Photoshop now, so you go to image, adjustments, posterize, or you can use an adjustment layer. And as you can see, it breaks it up into colors too. It makes it a little bit easier for Illustrator to interpret once you bring it in there. Now let's take a look at importing vector shapes between Illustrator and Photoshop. I'm going to draw a square. And by the way, these are Photoshop's vector capabilities. You've seen them in the vector video. They're very limited, and there's a reason why you might want to use Illustrator instead of Photoshop to create your vectors. In fact, I highly recommend it. So when I draw out my vector, it has all of its properties and everything, and I can edit it, get it how I want. But you're limited to your shapes and your pen tool here. If I copy this into Illustrator, I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I have a choice of pasting it as a compound path or a compound shape. And I want to click a compound shape, especially if it's not very complicated. And you'll notice once you get in there that you have the same capabilities as you would in Illustrator as you do in Photoshop as far as transforming. And the reason why you might want to work in Photoshop is because you don't, or in Illustrator, sorry, is because you don't have things like extrude and bevel, or at least you don't have the same at the same level as you do in Photoshop. Photoshop does have some 3D plugins, but you can add any of these, like particularly the warp. You can add any of these in Illustrator, and we'll just do a warp flag. Say if this was a country's flag, very simple flag. And now I'll show what happens if you drag this into Photoshop. And of course it's not expanded yet, so let's expand it. Object, expand. You want to do that anytime that you add an effect or alter the appearance, and you'll be able to tell it's expanded when it has the path and anchor points. So we'll drag this into Photoshop, and it creates it as a vector smart object, and before it even gives you the ability to do anything, you have the transform panel, so which is kind of handy. You can transform it, get it right where you want, and then hit enter. So let's take a look at placing objects and the difference. If you have a large object, you're always going to want to place it instead of just copy pasting it, or otherwise is into Illustrator or Photoshop. But let's take a look here and let's go to place. We have an option between place embedded and place linked. And embedded, like I was saying, is something like you would just copy and paste, and it's all of the information And linked, it'll actively link to a file, and it keeps your files a lot smaller. Now I went to place linked, and I'm just going to go up here and select red box, which is what I also have open in Illustrator over here. And it's going to give me an option. If it's a PDF with lots of pages, you choose the page. And it gives me a lot of cropping options here. We're just going to leave it on bounding box and hit OK. And like before, we can resize it before we put it in. But right now we have red box open, and we also have it open in Illustrator. And what you have down here is a little link. It's a little bit different than the smart object, the typical smart object item. So if we want to re-edit this, like as before, we can't do anything because it's still a smart object. Whereas we don't have the option of adjustments. And one other thing that you can't do as a smart object, which you'll notice, is you can't paint over it. It'll tell you right here it must be rasterized, and you just hit cancel. And if we go over here in Photoshop, we can double click this, and if it wasn't already open in Illustrator, it would open it. But since it is already open, and one of the coolest things we have with CC is I can make a change to this and save it. And as soon as I click back on Photoshop, the change is already made in here. It's a linked file, so that's why that's happening. So you can have all your vector smart objects. You can have everything in Photoshop, maintaining all of its Illustrator editing capabilities. So as you can see, you can have objects in here that are linked to Illustrator, and you can edit whatever else you want in Photoshop, like the background here, and what's appropriate to edit in Photoshop. And you can edit things in Illustrator that are appropriate to edit in Illustrator, and all comes back into Photoshop nicely and easily. And you'll notice with different versions, it's a little bit harder, but for the most part it's the same. You double click on this on a placed Illustrator file, and then you can actively edit it. And at any time you can always rasterize this layer, and keep in mind you get different things by clicking on the thumbnail and clicking on this. Anytime you can rasterize the layer, and it'll no longer be linked to the Illustrator file. However, you can paint over it and do other destructive changes. So that's it for working between Illustrator and Photoshop. There's a few more things. You could go talk about it for a whole day as far as getting right into the code and everything, but these are the most basic and most useful things. So thanks for watching.